Welcome back to Mr. Sheplack's class. Today's lesson, Chapter 3, Lesson 3, will cover subtracting integers. If you have not watched the video on either Lesson 1 or Lesson 2, please do that. You will need that information to continue forward and subtract integers because it will all intertwine. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Our first vocabulary lesson is additive inverse. Now these are two integers that are opposite, and a lot of people get this confused with absolute value. So absolute value, a lot of people think that that is the opposite. So absolute value, you have, say, -3 would equal 3, but the absolute value of 3 would equal 3 as well. If I'm looking at additive inverses, the additive inverse of -3 is 3. The additive inverse of 3 would be -3. So the additive inverse is the opposite. Again, the absolute value is the amount of units these numbers are away from 0. After vocabulary, we have our rule. It's only one rule for subtracting integers. So to subtract integers, you need to add its additive inverse. So this might be a little confusing at first, but we'll get through it. So this can be shown in symbols before we get to the actual numbers, and we have p minus a positive q. So this is saying that we have a positive number p minus a positive number q. And we can rewrite that as a positive number p adding a negative number q. So notice that we kept the original value of p. We changed the sign from subtraction to positive, and we also changed that a positive q turned into a negative q. So again, we add its additive inverse, so we're changing that to addition, changing that sign. So if this was a negative q, it would have turned into a positive q. So I've got two examples of this. We have 4 minus 9. So we could rewrite that as 4. We keep the 4 the same. We change the sign to a positive, or an addition sign. And we change our positive 9 to a negative 9. And that should equal -5. If we look at our other example, we have a positive 7 minus a -10. So again, we're keeping, changing, and changing. So we kept our 7, changed our sign to addition, and changed our sign from negative to positive. So if you ever see a minus a negative number, just know that you will be adding it as a positive number. So 7 plus 10 equals 17. It's just a quick, another example on that problem. Now we'll go ahead and give you an example in a second. There's some more examples. So let's take a look at the first example. We have 8 minus 13. So I'm going to automatically see that this is subtraction right away. So I'm going to use my rule where we need to add its additive inverse. So we're going to change that from 8 minus 13 to 8 plus a -13. Now again, I like to use my associative property that I briefly went over in the last lesson, and I'm going to change my -13 to the front, and I'm going to still add 8. Going to get the same answer, but it sets it up a little bit easier for me. So again, here we are, we're adding integers that have different signs. So my rule for that was we're incorporating our rule from lesson 2 into this lesson. My rule for that states that two different signs, we subtract their absolute values. So negative 13's absolute value is 13. 8, the absolute value of 8 is 8. So 13 minus 8 equals 5. And since my absolute value of the negative number was higher than the absolute value of my positive number, my answer is negative. Got a couple more examples. Next one, we have negative 10 minus 7. So again, we see subtraction, so I'm going to use my rule. We're going to keep the negative 10, change it to addition, and now we have a negative 7 instead of a positive. So I'm going back to lesson 2 where I see my rule here. I've got addition of two integers with the same sign, so I'm going to add their absolute values. Absolute value of negative 10 is 10. Absolute value of negative 7 is 7. 10 plus 7 is 17. And since both of my integers were negative, my answer is negative. Two more examples. The next one is 1 minus a negative 2. So I'm going to use my rule. I've got subtraction. I've got a positive 1 minus a negative 2. So I'm going to change my sign to addition. And the 2 becomes positive. So 1 plus 2. 1 plus 2 is very easy, and that equals 3. And I'm finished. Easy enough. Last example. And you might see this on your schoolwork. You will see evaluate x minus y if x equals negative 6 and y equals negative 5. So all I'm doing is plugging in these numbers for x and y. So it says that x is negative 6, so I'm going to write negative 6 minus, and y says y is negative 5. So my equation's still the same. I have x, which was negative 6, y, which is negative 5, and it's being subtracted. So I'm going to use my rule. I'm going to keep negative 6 where it is. I'm going to add, and I'm going to change my sign, positive 5. So I have negative 6 plus 5. Again, I'm going to use my rule. Going to use my rule where I have two different signs and I'm adding the integers, which means I'm subtracting their absolute values, which is 6 and 5. 6 minus 5 equals 1. And since my absolute value of negative 6 was higher than my absolute value of 5, my answer is negative. Negative 1. That covers Chapter 3, Lesson 3 on subtracting integers. And have a great rest of your day.